the senses. Here the yogin withdraws from all outside stimuli and completely focuses inwardly. And then the last 3 limbs could be seen as different levels of meditative absorption. Number 6 is dharana, concentration. 7, dhyana, meditation or contemplation. And lastly, the final step and the goal, the deepest form of meditation, samadhi or absorption. Here, the meditator becomes entirely absorbed into the pure awareness of the Purusha or the seer, and all else has disappeared. They have reached the state of kaivalya or independence of all things and realized their true nature, so to say. So this is the system of the 8 limbs of yoga that lies at the core of Patanjali's text and would become so influential and foundational for the school of yoga for the rest of history, even though later figures that adopted yoga changed certain things. So someone who belonged to the school of Advaita Vedanta could adopt yoga and would sort of adapt these ideas to the Advaitic framework rather than like a Sankhya metaphysics, for instance. But still, this Ashtanga yoga system that Patanjali presents here is very influential. And it is important to point out that this text, just like other sutras, are very obscure and hard to understand. If you saw a couple of them that I quoted, sutras are very short aphorisms. It's often just a sentence, sometimes hardly even a sentence, and they sometimes don't make any sense, like at all, and they always require a commentary or someone who has background knowledge who can sort of unpack these aphorisms. That's kind of their purpose. It's like there are these little aphorisms that are very difficult and obscure, but which hide all these incredibly complex and deep wisdoms that need to be unpacked by a master, right? And so that is why this tradition of commentaries on the sutras are so key and so important to these traditions. So historically, when you read the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, you would always read it with the bhashya, with the commentary alongside it. This bhashya or commentary is attributed to the legendary figure Vyasa, and it elucidates these short aphorisms in a way that is much more understandable. But although it is attributed to Vyasa, many scholars today increasingly accept the idea that it might be Patanjali himself who wrote the bhashya to his own sutras, which would further support the idea that they were truly meant to be read together. But it should be pointed out that not all scholars accept this new theory of its authorship. It's still quite a relatively new idea, but it's gaining more and more traction among scholarship. In any case, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and the school that came from it is arguably the origin of a self-conscious tradition of yoga in this way. But as we saw, even here it doesn't necessarily look all that familiar to the yoga that we know today, which are often almost exclusively dedicated to different bodily postures, the so-called asanas and other physical practices. By contrast, Patanjali's system is a lot more focused on meditation, where the asanas play only a partial role on the way as instructions on how to sit properly while doing the more central meditative practices. So where did this come from? Where does this modern Western focus on asana in particular come from? Is this simply a modern Western invention, or does this have precedence in the earlier yogic tradition? Well, in the centuries following the composition of the Yoga Sutras, there eventually started developing new ideas and techniques within this wider school of yoga. And in the Middle Ages, this eventually led to the very significant emergence of a certain method or tendency within yoga known as Hatha Yoga, the yoga of force. To understand this development, we need to back up a little bit and look at the changing landscape of early medieval India, where very interesting innovations were being made. Indeed, according to the research of people like James Mallinson, Mark Singleton, and others, this emergence of Hatha Yoga was the result of some particular developments, especially a synthesis between the older Muni Brahmanical ascetical traditions that focused on tapas and ascetic austerities, which we mentioned earlier, and a new, very important movement known as Tantra. I'm sure many of you have heard about Tantra, and I'm sure many of you also basically only associate that with sex, which is a mistaken and at least very much oversimplified view of the topic. I've dedicated a full episode to the topic previously, which you can check out if you're interested in diving deeper into that. But Tantra, in broad strokes, is a general movement that emerged in the second half of the first millennium CE and was based on a group of texts which were known, conveniently, as Tantras. What made these Tantras and their teachings stand out were their focus on the physical body as a kind of microcosm. It certainly did not have the Sankhya perspective of reality, where the material world is essentially separated from the spiritual or divine and needed to be transcended. Instead, Tantra teaches that the material world is in fact divine in itself. It is the manifestation or expression of the creative force of divinity, often called Shakti. So instead of turning away from the body with austerities as such, Tantra teaches us to use the body, its senses, etc., as a tool to reach enlightenment. It's important also to point out here that Tantra was not just a Hindu phenomenon. Rather, it was a much broader general movement that crossed the borders between the different religions. So there was both Vaishnavite and Shaivite Tantra, there was Tantric Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, and Jain Tantra. And while there will obviously be differences, they generally share these basic characteristics. In the process, the Tantrikas developed new ideas about the body and its spiritual forces, including the system of chakras, extending from the base of the spine to the crown of the head as energy centers in the body to be employed, as well as different channels in the body. You've all heard about these topics, perhaps from yoga, for example, about these chakras and these bodily channels of energy and so on. This very much emerged from Tantra. Famously, it is Tantra that also talks about Kundalini as a serpentine divine force that hides in the lowest chakra, but which can be awakened as it coils up the channel and the other chakras until reaching the crown chakra at the head, leading to a Kundalini awakening or enlightenment experience. This was all achieved through tantric practices like chanting mantras, visualization techniques involving mandalas and divine beings, and being initiated by a guru into the secret esoteric teachings. This tantric movement would play a decisive role in the development of hatha and postural yoga, with its focus on the body, and many tantric techniques have found their way directly into yoga in that way too. In fact, because the Tantric Buddhists were so significant for this wider movement at the time, it has recently come to light that some of the earliest texts of and influences on postural yoga, Hatha Yoga, actually come from Buddhism. Like, for example, what is considered the very first text of Hatha Yoga, the Amrita Siddhi. The emergence of Hatha Yoga, with its major focus on asanas, postures, and a kind of revival of the older ascetical practices of the Shramana movement, became decisive for its development, especially into the form that we recognize today. The methods of Hatha Yoga were often used as a kind of supplement to Patanjali's eight-limbed yoga, as so being used alongside it, basically. And in fact, sometimes it seems that this postural yoga was talked about in almost a pejorative way, as a way to practice yoga for the people who weren't able to do the meditation techniques of Patanjali for some reason. This was like an easier way to do it, right? So sometimes we see it talked about in a kind of pejorative way in this way. Quote, Hatha Yoga's methods draw from those of Patanjala and Tantric Yoga, but also include physical practices found in neither. These are cleansing techniques, non-seated postures, asanas, complex methods of breath control, and physical means of manipulating the vital energy, mudras. Although these practices are taught for the first time in Hatha Yoga text, many of them, in particular the asanas and mudras, bear a close similarity to ascetic practices first mentioned in the latter half of the first millennium BCE, shortly after the time of the Buddha. In the Middle Ages, we see an increasing number of texts about Hatha Yoga, and it gradually became incorporated into the wider Patanjala tradition of yoga. The 13th century Vaishnava text, the Treya Yoga Shastra, is sometimes considered the first text to present a systematized form of Hatha Yoga, and stands alongside other texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika from the 15th century as the most famous and influential expressions of this tradition. And one of the significant things about these texts is that even though they were often written from within a specific religious or philosophical tradition, so the Amrita Siddhis, Buddhist, other texts are Shaiva texts, etc., they are often quite non-sectarian, open in their approach. They will focus on the methods and techniques, but leave things open enough that these techniques can and have been adopted by people from various traditions, whether they are Vaishnava, Shaiva, Buddhist, Jain, or even Muslim, Christian, and secular today. And this is not only true of Hatha Yoga, but really of the entire tradition of yoga. While we have seen that the Yoga Sutras and the wider Patanjala Yoga Shastra presents a very clear metaphysical or philosophical framework, that of the Sankhya school in particular, this doesn't mean that the two must necessarily go together. Rather, the methods and teachings of yoga have been adapted and used by people of all schools. So that when you read works of non-dual Shaivism in Kashmir of the Middle Ages, they also talk about yoga and yogic techniques, often borrowing directly from these earlier traditions, but will of course adapt and change things slightly to fit with a non-dualistic metaphysics rather than the dualistic one of the Sankhya school. So yoga is very malleable in that way and exists in Advaita, in Dvaita, Tantra, and all other kinds of schools. And as yoga, and especially Hatha Yoga, became more prominent in the later Middle Ages and in the early modern period, this had really interesting effects on the religious landscape, especially as other non-dharmic religions like Islam became more prominent on the subcontinent. Indeed, and surprisingly to some, given the current situation in the region, the traditions of Hinduism and Islam were in great conversation and dialogue for many centuries, and we can see how the two influence each other in some ways, leading to very fascinating development. This becomes perhaps most clear during the Mughal period, where we see some examples of very open interactions between Muslims, particularly Sufi Muslims, and Hindus, where representatives on both sides see similarities and common ground in their different religions. We explored one very famous example of this, the Prince Dara Shukko, in an earlier episode. Already as early as the 11th century, we see Muslims taking an interest in the teachings of Hindu texts and sages. The famous polymath al-Biruni actually translated Patanjali's Yoga Sutra into Arabic and seems to show a genuine interest in their culture and religions. But like we said, by the time of the Mughal Empire, these interactions had gone on for quite a while, and we can see how Muslim Sufis seems to have adopted certain yogic practices and incorporated them into their Islamic spirituality. Indeed, the perspective on these matters by many scholars at the time were significantly more nuanced than what many might imagine today. We have seen that Muslim authorities engaged in translating and studying Hindu books and interpreting their teachings, for example. There were Sufi writers like Abdurrahman al-Shishti commenting on the Bhagavad Gita, theorizing that deities like Krishna and Rama were in fact prophets of God, just like Muhammad or Jesus, and that just like with Christianity and Judaism, Hinduism was also originally a religion revealed by God that had gone astray over time. Thus, many saw value in some teachings that this tradition contained. It didn't escape people on both sides at that time that there were significant similarities between Islam, particularly as understood through Sufism and certain metaphysical doctrines or schools like Wahdat al-Wujud, the unity of being, and certain Hindu schools of thought like Advaita Vedanta. And we see how people from both sides recognize these similarities and see that the same truths seem to exist on the other side, so to say. The Muslims recognized that what they saw as the educated Hindus, who didn't worship idols but were these more non-dual sort of ascetics and so on, were worshipping God, right? They call them often the al-Muwahidun al-Hind, the Indian monotheists, as opposed to other Hindus who were idol worshippers, for example. So there's significantly more nuance here than what many might imagine, especially given the situation in India and the Indian subcontinent in the modern world. And this view of the Hindus as having true teachings, being monotheists, and having many of the same ideas as Islam, essentially, also, of course, legitimized taking inspiration from their sort of teachings and practices. Probably the most famous and profound expression of this quote-unquote Islamic yoga is the 16th century Sufi master Muhammad Gauth. He belonged to the Shatari Sufi order and has become famous for writing the Bahr al-Hayat, the Ocean of Light in Persian, which in fact seems to be a kind of translation of an earlier Arabic work, which might in turn have been a translation of a now lost yogic text called the Amrita Kunda. In any case, the Bahr al-Hayat describes various practices of meditation, including asanas, and it also contains some truly beautiful illustrations of these postures. These illustrations are really gems that we can use to get a glimpse into these postures as they were understood at that time in history. And there's a lot more to explore when it comes to yoga and Islam, which maybe we could dedicate a future episode to instead of covering it too much here. But certainly this interaction between Muslims and Hindus and even Christians later on in history also affected the way that yoga was practiced and seen and how it developed over time. But it's not just Islam that has been in contact with yoga. As we know, eventually in the modern world, yoga made a very triumphant entrance into the Western world. And today it is very, very popular. So how did this happen? How did it go from this relatively obscure, at that time in the modern world at least, obscure practice in India to being like mainstream practiced by people from all walks of life in Europe and America today? Well, it's a story that really starts in the 19th and 20th centuries. Just like when we talked about Vedanta and its modern history, the figure of Swami Vivekananda and his influence in the West is a significant point in this process. But it's certainly not a process that is straightforward in any way. Mark Singleton's by now classic book Yoga Body from 2010 covers this development of modern postural yoga in a very comprehensive way, which is a highly recommended book. He straddles a line between the two extremes of saying that modern postural yoga is nothing but a Western 20th century invention that has nothing to do with quote-unquote real yoga as practiced in India on the one hand, and that of saying that these techniques stretch back thousands of years on the other. Instead, he argues that modern postural yoga as we know it is the result of another kind of syncretism between the Hatha yoga that had developed in India and various types of gymnastics, bodybuilding and fitness practices both within India itself, but significantly also in the West. Indeed, by the 19th and 20th century, postural yoga practices were kind of looked down upon in India. It was associated with street performers and such things, and as opposed to the pure meditative yoga in the lineage of someone like Patanjali. In other words, it's really with the influx of these yoga practices into the West, with figures like Krishnamacharya, Yogananda, and Patbhi Jois, just to mention a few, and the reshaping of yoga to the Western audience, and with an increased focus particularly on the physical postural practices, that we finally see the emergence of modern postural yoga as we know it. Singleton says, quote, "Posture-based yoga as we know it today is the result of a dialogical exchange between para-religious modern body culture techniques developed in the West and the various discourses of modern Hindu yoga that emerged from the time of Vivekananda onward. Although it routinely appeals to the tradition of Indian Hatha yoga, contemporary posture-based yoga cannot really be considered a direct successor of this tradition." But he later nuances this last claim by also saying, quote, "This does not mean that the kind of posture-based yogas that predominate globally today are mere gymnastics, nor that they are necessarily less real or spiritual than other forms of yoga. The history of modern physical culture overlaps and intersects with the histories of para-religious, unchurched spirituality. Western esotericism, medicine, health and hygiene, chiropractic, osteopathy and bodywork, body-centered psychotherapy, the modern revival of Hinduism, and the socio-political demands of the emergent modern Indian nation, to name but a few. They may indeed be at variance with classical yoga, but it does not follow from this that these practices, beliefs and aspirations, whether conceived of as yoga or not, are thereby lacking in seriousness, dignity, or spiritual profundity." The spread of yoga in the West was helped by various social and political developments too, such as the counterculture movement in the 60s, with significant people like the Beatles embracing Indian culture and spirituality, as well as an increased interest in fitness, of which yoga became increasingly seen as a viable method. But with this, of course, also came the increased commercialization of yoga, and at this point you can basically find yoga everywhere. There are books about yoga being sold in bookstores, yoga studios can be found in almost all major cities, Major celebrities practice yoga and often promote it in different ways. In the US alone, there were over 33 million practitioners of yoga reported in 2023, which is a significant portion of the population. But this also leads to certain discussions regarding the nature of yoga and its relationship with Hinduism. Is yoga religion? Is it spirituality? Can the two even be separated from each other, or is it simply a form of physical exercise? Debates regarding these questions are still raging in public discussions. We see Christian authorities claiming that yoga is demonic and a form of paganism, being so intimately connected with Hinduism, while others adopt it without any issue. Like I said in the beginning, there are churches that organize yoga sessions in church, etc., so it's a very complicated situation in that way. And it is indeed true that many people in the West today have an image of yoga as something that is not necessarily quote-unquote religious. It's interesting because I saw a clip the other day on TikTok or something where someone was talking about how they were bothered when people sort of would push religion into his face, right? He was talking about, they talk about Jesus in inappropriate situations. And then he used as an example that what if I went to the yoga studio and they started talking to me about Jesus? Which was a really interesting thing because he's going to a yoga studio to do yoga, which will often involve, not always, but often involve chanting names of Hindu deities, like mantras from the Upanishads, and many, as we've explored in this video, a lot of postures and ideas and philosophies that are very much connected to this deep religious tradition from India. And yet, it's not seen as religious in the same way that talking about Jesus is seen as religious. This is a really interesting example of how people view religion and the role that yoga has come to play in modern society in that way. Again, this is not true of all yoga, of course, as many studios and teachers have made an effort to strip it entirely of references to the Indic or Dharmic traditions. But can this ever be fully accomplished? As we've seen, yoga is a wide tradition that very much developed in the context of the different Indian religious and spiritual traditions, even if it has often been pretty non-sectarian in nature. These questions become very relevant today as yoga has become a worldwide phenomenon, to the point that even in India itself, it has become quite popular again, which was not the case only a few decades ago. Some Hindus, though, feel like their tradition is being appropriated and commercialized, stripped of all its central religious contents for a mass market and Western audience. And in many ways, this is true, right? But at the same time, yoga has always been a tradition that has changed and evolved, that has adapted to different cultural and religious circumstances, and still continue to flourish. So who gets to say what true yoga is, or who yoga belongs to? These are questions that don't really have an answer, but I hope that this episode has given you an insight into the complex history and development and diversity of yoga, so that you can better understand how this very popular modern practice, physical exercise, connects to deep religious traditions, but also perhaps how modern yoga also stands on its own in different ways, right? This is a really fascinating topic and one that is very relevant today because discussions about it are being had all the time and from various different angles. And so hopefully this episode has given you more nuanced information so you can participate and understand those discussions and debates a little bit better. Or at the very least, perhaps given you some, or piqued your curiosity about one of India's greatest exports in history. Again, I want to remind you that my new single, Good All Stink, came out today, and I would love it if you checked it out. If you enjoy my music, or if you don't enjoy my music, I would love it if you checked it out regardless. Let me know what you think of it, share it if you like it, and so on. I would highly appreciate if you check that out. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I want to give a special shout out to my patrons over on Patreon who keep this channel going monetarily, without whom none of this would be possible. If anyone else wanted to become a patron or wants to become a patron, I will leave links to that in the description. Again, that really is the best way to support this channel and my goal of bringing you free content on these kinds of fascinating and very important topics of religion, philosophy, history, mysticism, all these kinds of topics that I think a lot of you are so passionate about. So check out my Patreon if you're interested in supporting me. You can also leave a one-time donation through PayPal. If you're interested in following me and my works generally, you can check out my socials, or you can check out my other channel, Philip Holm, where I post my music, including that new single that I just mentioned. You can find that over there on that channel, as well as other music content similar to this channel. So thank you so much again for watching. I really appreciate all of your feedback, all of the comments, all the support, and I'm really proud of this community. So thank you all so much, and I will see you next time.
I know where